Thank you for joining us this evening. This program is entitled Building Chicago's Public Spaces with Julia Bachrach. We are hosting it in conjunction with the exhibit From Swamps to Parks, Building Chicago's Public Spaces, on display now at Harold Washington Library Center in the exhibit hall on the 9th floor. We're grateful to our co-sponsor, the Chicago Architecture Center, and you'll hear briefly from them at the end of the program. My name is Johanna Russ, and I'm an archivist here at Chicago Public Library's Special Collections. For the last 7 years, I've overseen the vast archival collections transferred here from the Chicago Park District, including over 106,000 landscape and architectural drawings and over 62,000 photographs. I've had the good fortune to work closely with tonight's speaker over those 7 years on many projects related to this collection, including curating the exhibit just mentioned. And now I'd like to introduce Julia Bachrach. She is an author, lecturer, and historic preservation consultant who previously served as Chicago Park District historian and preservationist for 28 years. Julia has written extensively on various topics relating to Chicago history. Her books include The City in a Garden, A History of Chicago's Parks, and Inspired by Nature, the Garfield Park Conservatory and Chicago's West Side. She has also contributed to other books such as Art Deco Chicago, Midwestern Landscape Architecture, Oxford Companion to the Garden, and the AIA Guide to Chicago Architecture. She gives tours, lectures, and seminars, and writes a monthly blog post that is available on her website at www.jbachrach.com. And without further ado, I will hand it over to her.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited. I do want to ask you, Joe, if somebody's still letting people in the waiting room, because since I'm the co-host or something, I keep seeing people going in the waiting room. So hopefully somebody's working on that.
Yeah, we're on that.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just thrilled to be here tonight. I was very, very excited about this response. And I know that lots of my friends and colleagues are participating. Because this is being recorded, I've been asked not to say people's names, so I will do my best not to, but I do want to give a shout out to all the CAC docents who are here tonight and do such great works to help share information about the history of Chicago, especially Chicago Park. So those of you who know me know this is a topic that is really my passion. So I'm just really excited and thrilled about this. Basically, the exhibit that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second highlights 6 kind of iconic themes / places within the Chicago Park system. And I decided that for tonight's program that I would focus on 2 of them, which is the history of the Museum of Science and Industry, which of course, as most of you know, started out as the Palace of Fine Arts at the World's Columbian Exposition, and the history of the fieldhouse, a building type invented in Chicago. And as you will learn, these 2 themes are kind of intimately connected with each other. Joe gave a great introduction to the Chicago Park District Archives, and many of you probably know or remember, had the honor of knowing or even hearing from Ed Euler, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. Ed was an architect, just an amazing person, and he was with the Chicago Park District for many years. In 1987, he had recently been promoted as the head of architecture and engineering. At that point, as you may remember, Walter Netsch was the president of the Park District Board, and Ed ended up unearthing this amazing resource of archives in a sub-basement vault underneath Soldier Field. And it was really kind of his vision that there was a lot of archival drawings, landscape drawings and architectural drawings that had been kind of stored away for decades in this vault, and he unearthed it. And there was a Chicago Tribune magazine story that was kind of a follow-up to this. But then Ed really decided that the Park District must do something with these materials, and he developed it as an archive. He established a preservation unit, and he hired me to head that unit the following year. And of course, I was a precocious 10-year-old when they hired me in 1988. And so that Park District Archive really became the basis for a lot of work, the restoration of parks and park facilities and sculptures, as well as landmark nominations and lots of scholarship. And so as I was getting ready to leave the Park District, I was kind of thrilled when the administrators, even the superintendent, had decided that kind of now that digitization is out there as a thing that we could do, that we had to figure out a way to digitize the collection and transfer it to our sister agency, which is the Chicago Public Library. And so as Joe mentioned, she and I and a couple of other colleagues at the Chicago Public Library Special Collections got a chance to work really closely together to figure out how to make sure that this amazing resource was all completely digitized, and just figuring out even how to physically transfer it from one place to another was, it was kind of a Herculean type thing. But so today, as Joe mentioned, there's over 106,000 plans and drawings that are at Harold Washington Library, beautifully, cared for, as you can see, kind of behind the scenes in these big acid-free folders, and over 60,000 historic photos that are in those Hollinger boxes. They also have a lot of the documents. And these are materials that you can use. They have a reading room, and you can go there by appointment only. And Joe has really become quite a knowledgeable staff member, professional about this particular collection. As we were making this transfer, and it was a couple of years of working together, and then I was leaving the Park District in 2017, Joe told me that she and some of her colleagues had this dream of having an exhibit highlighting the collection, and that they would want to work with me as a consultant. So that was so exciting. I couldn't wait for that to happen. Little did we know that when this exhibit would be open, which we had planned it for this summer, that we'd be in this kind of new reality of COVID. And so the exhibit was delayed quite a bit, but it has opened. I don't know if you've ever been up there in the little small exhibition room next to the reading room. It's right next to the room where you can, page, make an appointment to use some of those materials. But it is open. They're really doing a great job with being very careful during COVID. So they have, there's very few people that you'll see in the library, but I do hope you'll get a chance to visit. We picked the theme of From Swamps to Parks because we really wanted to emphasize and explore the tremendous work, vision, fortitude, money, all of the ambitious effort that it took to transform Chicago's stinky onion, marshy landscape into the most beloved public spaces in Chicago, both landscapes and buildings. And so that's really the theme of the exhibit. The grants that we had secured to digitize the material and transfer the archives included some money for conservation. And so the Chicago Public Library archivist, Joe and her colleagues, were able to, they came up with a scale, and there was this whole system for when they created the finding aid for the materials. They also rated the condition of all the materials. Among the probably most damaged and most significant of the collection was a set of 18 drawings of the Museum of Science and Industry, but really of the Fine Arts Palace at the World's Columbian Exposition, by Charles Atwood and Daniel Burnham, really by Atwood as the then chief of design, under Burnham, the chief of construction. These drawings, as you can see, I think they had been, at one time folded, at one time rolled. These were in that sub-basement vault where Ed kind of unearthed things. There were losses, broken off pieces. They were filthy, dirty. And the Chicago Public Library hired a conservation expert, a paper conservation expert, to work on this set of drawings. I can't remember if I said, but they're 7 feet tall. It's huge. They're amazing. It's too bad that they really are kind of difficult to photograph. But in the exhibition, you will see every step that the archivist had to take. She came in 3 days a week for 6 months to work on these drawings, and it's just kind of an amazing thing. Of course, really my focus is the history of this building. And so now I'm going to kind of transition a little bit to history, and I'm sorry it is a little hard to see these drawings. But as I mentioned, by the time that those drawings were produced, and those drawings were, hand drawn by Atwood, but the ones that no one really knows exactly where the original hand drawn drawings ended up. So these are the only set of prints of those drawings that are really known about. By that time, Burnham had become the chief of construction. But he really sort of started with kind of humble beginnings. He was born in New York and grew up in Chicago. And he was from a fairly well-to-do family, and they sent him to a prep school in New England, and they thought he would, attend Harvard or Yale, and he didn't get into any of the Ivy League schools. He really wasn't that great of a student. So he came back home to Chicago, and he became an apprentice under the architect William LeBaron-Jenney. And he really liked it. He was a young guy, but then he dabbled in a couple of other jobs, and then decided that he really wanted to be an architect. Worked for a couple of other firms, and by the time of the early 1870s, after the Great Chicago Fire, he was working for the firm of Carter, Drake, and White. And there he met John Wellborn Root, a very warm, kind of a little bit more soft-spoken guy, a couple of years younger than him, a really talented designer. The two of them, Peter White of the firm, really sort of mentored them, encouraged them. They decided to start their own firm. And Burnham later said that with a couple of pencils, a piece of rubber, a few boards, 2 stools, and a dozen thumbtacks, we did business. So they really started in a very humble kind of way. It's kind of 2 young guys. Their timing was great because Chicago was being rebuilt after the fire. They got really lucky because somebody recommended them. They really were just getting little jobs here and there. But somebody recommended them to John Sherman. John Sherman was the owner of the Union Stockyards, and he wanted to build a mansion in the new up-and-coming Prairie Avenue area near South Side, and he hired Burnham and Root, and so now they had a really important commission. When Burnham would go to meet with the Shermans to talk to them about what they wanted in their new house, who would answer the door but their beautiful young daughter, in her early 20s, Margaret Sherman. She was quite smitten with Burnham, and she started finding excuses to come to the job site. And sorry, I've got my cat here. I was worried about my dog being invasive, and I've got the cat. So they fell in love, and they got married. And do you think that John Sherman was going to allow his daughter to be married to a struggling architect? This was one of the wealthiest guys in Chicago. So he immediately started hiring Burnham and Root. And of course, they were very talented. I don't mean this as to, criticize them, but they now had, a very, very good connection. And so they got to design buildings for Sherman, like the Chicago Stockyards. John Sherman was also a member of the South Park Board of Commissioners. And so Burnham and Root now would become the go-to architects for the South Park Commission. Now, the South Park Commission was formed in 1869, and it was actually empowered by the state, but the idea was, and one of the kind of big sort of lead sort of thinkers and planners behind it was Paul Cornell. And the idea was to create one huge, magnificent park for this kind of growing South Side part of it was really at the border of the city. It was 1,055 acres. The South Park Commission had downtown within their taxing jurisdiction. And so because of that, they had a good budget. They were able to hire the man who we now consider the father of American landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted, to lay out their park. And this was his original plan. Olmsted came from New York. He had laid out Central Park already, and he was not exactly in love with our stinky onion Chicago landscape, But he thought we had one really great thing going for us, and that the South Park commissioners did, because it was also going for their site, and that was Lake Michigan. And he said that the lake by artificial means could be made no more grand or sublime. And so he used the lake as the guiding theme for this plan. And I can use my little cursor and show you that the eastern division of the plan, which is now Jackson Park, he wanted you to be able to enter, oops, I didn't do that on purpose, by boat and go navigate through a very rugged series of waterways down a formal basin into this little lake. And then when you got to the western division, Washington Park, you can see this green blob, and that was meant to be a sheep meadow. And so he had this really ambitious vision. The South Park commissioners had hoped to build the whole park all at once, but of course they weren't able to do that. There were several obstacles, one being the Chicago fire. They burnt their tax rolls. They had some problems with land acquisition, things like that. And so the park evolved slowly. This is what it looked like in 1880. The northern part of the park had been executed, the part in green, and then the rest is all the work that still needed to be done, and it's showing you Olmsted's original plan. By this time, the commissioners were using Burnham and Root for architectural projects, including the bridge that you see here, which we later became known as the Clarence Darrow Bridge, which is right here. So as the park was slowly evolving, some of the people that were involved with the South Park Commission became involved with a new movement to try to secure the World's Fair for Chicago. There were Chicagoans in the late 1880s that felt that the next World's Fair, that Chicago should be the host. And so by 1889, there were people in Chicago that went to the Paris Fair, the Exposition Universelle, to get ideas and come back and start really promoting the idea of that Chicago should win the honor of hosting the fair. It really came down to two cities, Chicago and New York. Here you can see that Senator Cullum was one of the big leaders in this movement to bring the fair to Chicago. New Yorkers were really surprised when Chicago did win the honor by Congress in 1890. And at that point, Burnham and Root were appointed as consulting landscape architects. They had asked Olmsted and his young associate, Henry Codman, to come to Chicago and help find a site. Olmsted did this very exhaustive study of a whole bunch of different sites. For a long time, they thought there were going to be two sites, one downtown and one somewhere else. And then they finally decided on Jackson Park, partly because Olmsted wanted to have the lake as a backdrop. And partly, that was a big part, but he also really liked the fact that Jackson Park hadn't been completed and you wouldn't have to undo finished landscape. There was a famous story that Olmsted wrote about. He published a couple versions of this article talking about how he and Codman, who ends up not living to see the fair, and then Burnham and Root had this session with giant pieces of brown paper. And whenever I read this story, I picture them sitting on the floor with these big pieces of paper trying to make a template, but they were probably standing at drafting tables. It's just that I picture these giant pieces of paper as being too big for a drafting table. But at any rate, they were cutting out these different shapes and laying them out and kind of just coming up with a basic template for the fairgrounds. And Olmsted wrote, they decided that there should be a great architectural court with a body of water therein, that there should be a formal canal leading northward to this court, from this court to a series of broader waters of a lagoon character, so that the principal exposition buildings would each have water as well as land frontage and would be approachable by boat. So it's a lot of the same concepts as the original plan, this idea of interconnected water that you could boat on from Lake Michigan. But this idea of the exposition buildings sort of fronting onto a court was the idea of the court of honor. So these are these huge exposition halls that would then front onto this court of honor. Now, Burnham and Root could have decided to design all the buildings themselves, but they didn't think that was a good idea and they really didn't have time to do it. They could have decided that all the architects would have just been Midwesterners, but they really felt that there should be the most prominent architects in America, who of course were Eastern firms, that they should be involved. And so they invited 5 really like leading architectural firms from New York and Boston to design major exposition buildings for the fair. And they made the invitation in 1890, and they got very little response. They were kind of surprised. So then Burnham went and made a trip to New York and met with some of these architects, and got started, and he was a very convincing guy. So he started kind of getting some response, and then he invited them all to come to Chicago. So they hadn't yet accepted, but they said they would come to Chicago and meet and discuss this. And so Burnham and Root decided to like lay out, you know, they were going to no holds bars, like have this fantastic week, you know, 5-day experience, whatever, for the architects to come to Chicago, and they were just going to wow them and get them on board because they needed them and they wanted them and thought it was important. So the event included bringing the architects, the out-of-town architects, out to see the Jackson Park site. And when they got there and they saw kind of the flat, marshy, unimproved site, they were not that thrilled. They were kind of worried about how they were going to pull this off. This was on January 10th, 1891. And Robert Peabody, one of the architects from Boston, said to Burnham, you really mean to say that you're expecting to open a fair here by 93? And yes, said Burnham, we intend to. And then he said, it can't be done. And Burnham said, that point has already been decided. So it's already settled. The next day, Sunday, now Root didn't show up that day. The next day, Sunday, he invited the architects to come over to his home on Astor Street. He had a cold, he wasn't feeling well, and much to everyone's shock, he died of pneumonia on January 15th. And this was just horrible for everybody, but especially for Burnham, who just lost his best friend and business partner. And they were very busy in their private business, in addition to having taken on this you know, huge role. So Burnham, of course, has to kind of push forward. And so the architects continue to work, and he's, you know, finally getting everyone to jump on board. And by selecting these Eastern architects, it was clear that the Fairgrounds would have a Beaux Arts style. And the Beaux Arts, of course, was the École de Beaux Arts, the famous French school of art and architecture in Paris. And many of these Eastern architects were either trained there, like Richard Morris Hunt, who designed the administration building, or some of the architects were trained by Hunt or other architects who had gone to the École. And so the École de Beaux Arts, that was a very kind of formal classical approach to design and architecture. And it harks back to ancient Greek and Roman forms and buildings. And then of course uses very straight lines and symmetry. And it, you know, that is also the style. This is the Paris Exposition from 1889. That was also the style of the Paris Exposition. So the Beaux Arts, you know, that was just by sort of selecting those architects, it was kind of meaning you were going to end up with Beaux Arts. But, you know, as the design unfolded and now Root was gone, it became even more kind of this really classical vision. And by the end, there was the decision to paint all the buildings white, and it became the White City. It would create uniformity. It would have this great contrast with the blue sky. And it was, you could do it fast and inexpensively. So we ended up with this kind of White City. But you know, in the immediate period after losing Root, this was just awful for Burnham, and he really had to figure out how to move forward. And I'm sure some of you have read The City of the Century or Devil in the White City, and that this point is really emphasized. Oh, oops, I just almost blew it. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. And I practiced a bunch of times today. But talking about the classical Beaux-Arts style and training, there was one architect who did spend some time at the École de Beaux-Arts who ended up deciding to follow a completely different style and didn't want to follow the principles of the Beaux-Arts, and that was Louis Sullivan, sorry about that, who designed the transportation building. It was not a white building. It was not a classical, you know, bringing up ancient forms. It was a very Sullivan building in warm colors of oranges and yellows with a famous, enormous golden arched doorway. In those weeks following Root's death, Burnham realized he was going to have to replace Root, and it was going to be tough. And he needed to find someone that could fit into that sort of Beaux Arts mold because, you know, they were both for the exposition itself and then for the kinds of buildings that Burnham and Root had done. They did a lot of, you know, buildings that were very sort of Gothic and using a lot of beautiful, even in their Chicago school structures. And so he needed an architect that could really produce a lot of work quickly, could fit into this, you know, mold that he needed. And so two of the East Coast architects, two of his colleagues, recommended the same guy, Charles Bowler Atwood, who was also from the East Coast. And Burnham decided that he would go interview him. And so he had written to Atwood, and they agreed that they would have a meeting at a certain day at a certain time at the hotel where Burnham would stay in New York. And so Burnham goes to have this meeting with Atwood, and he's there at the appointed time, and Atwood doesn't show up. And he's waiting and waiting, and he waits over an hour, and he gets really frustrated and gets up and leaves. And he's exiting the hotel, and he's now in the street, and this guy comes running up to him. Mr. Burnham, I'm Charles Atwood. Would you like to interview me? And Burnham was kind of annoyed, and he said, I'm going to have to think about that. So Burnham goes to the train station. Atwood follows him to the train station, which Burnham doesn't realize. Burnham takes a train back to Chicago, goes directly from the train ride, you know, arrives in Chicago and goes directly to his office to get back to work in the Rookery, the new Burnham and Root building where they had just moved their office to. And just an hour or a couple of hours later, Atwood shows up and said, would you like to interview me now? And Burnham thought that was such great perseverance that he hires him on the spot. And Atwood turns out to end up, you know, as I mentioned, he becomes the chief of design. He ends up becoming a really important player in the design of the Columbian Exposition. Later, Burnham says that Atwood's work in the exposition is known to everyone. He designed the art building, the peristyle, the terminal building, the terraces, the bridges, the rostral columns, the service building, the forestry, and many minor decorative features. His critical taste was largely due to the final finish. This is where I can't see. Oh, well, something. Some of my words are get blocked here. Something, the final finish, something of the fair as a whole. Sorry about that. You probably can read it, and I can't. This little thing keeps popping up. But at any rate, he produced a lot of the buildings. I've heard in the 70s, I've heard in the 90s, including a number of really important ones. And arguably the most important was the Fine Arts Palace, which is right here. And of course is now the Museum of Science and Industry. This is the Illinois building. If that looks familiar to you, it looks a lot like our state capitol. So he did the peristyle. That was also an Atwood building. And here you see Burnham at his drafting table. So this photo, by the way, this one is so beautiful. I have it blown up on my screensaver, and I just try to lose myself in it. You can really get into the details. So at any rate, he is now a really important player in the development of the fair, and he is now designing the Fine Arts Palace, and it's an important part of the Fairgrounds. And don't kid yourself, the fact that it's over here by itself doesn't mean it's any less important than all of these buildings on the Court of Honor. And they very purposefully put the Fine Arts Palace, sited it up at the north end of the park, separate from all the other buildings, because these buildings were made out of staff, a type of plaster mixed with hemp, and they were believed to be very flammable. And so they thought the art museum, they had to be especially careful about, because there would be, you know, world-class collection of art, some that would be lent by really important donors, and they were irreplaceable. So they couldn't risk having a fire. Also, you would get it to have this beautiful frontage of this, what we called the North Pond or the Columbia Basin. So, so here's one of those beautiful drawings. I think this is the one that you can see at the, in the exposition, the exhibition. We don't get to go to the exposition. And there he drew in the caryatids, the kind of lady women sculptures that hold up a little portico. It's full of lots of detail. There's even little lions drawn in. So it's just these really fabulously detailed drawings. The building would be one of the first to be constructed, and there it is. It's just amazing when you see the hand work that had to go into actually building the fair. But so there it is, and you can see in the fall of 1891, they're going to get started. I forgot to mention that the fair itself was delayed, and that really wasn't Chicago's fault. So, you know, it was supposed to celebrate the quote unquote discovery of America by Columbus in 1892. So they decided that they would have a big event on Columbus Day of 1892, but the real opening wouldn't be until 1893. They wanted the art museum, the building, to be completed by Columbus Day. And it was. But you can see what an amazing process. And by the way, the Chicago Public Library Special Collections has other really fabulous resources relating to the history of the fair. They have all of these C.D. Arnold, who's the official fair photographer, and they have a whole huge folio of his photographs. And so this documents what the building looked like in 1892 in the spring and in the summer. It had a fire vaulted interior, so it was built as a little bit more permanent than the other buildings. This article came out in the Tribune on October 19th, 1892. And basically, I get the impression that everybody was really nervous about the progress of the fair. It was so ambitious, and we've all read about all of the terrible winter blizzards and everything that Burnham and all of the laborers and everybody went through. It was a lot of struggle to make sure that the fair was going to happen. So here we are now, kind of close to Columbus Day, or right around the time of Columbus Day, and they wanted to make sure that the fairgrounds was actually going to be built on time to open for May of 1893. And so this article is about how, you know, the landscape is starting to be, you know, this beautiful, you know, instead of the old swamps and scrub oaks, that it's turning into this beautiful green landscape with beautiful water basins and things like that. And then it said that the report also talked about that the buildings commencing with the fine art structure, which was pronounced practically fireproof. So it is already, people are very, very excited about this building, even as other buildings had barely yet begun to be constructed. And, you know, of course, it was sort of the premier building that really harks back to ancient forms. It's both sort of makes references to both ancient, you know, the Pantheon, which is an ancient Roman building, and the Acropolis in Greece. And so there was, Burnham had this sort of famous little quote that he said that Augustus St. Gaudens, who was really the most famous sculptor in America and was involved with the fair, as the building was being finished, sort of rushed to come and see him. And he said, "Do you realize the rank of Atwood's art building among all of the structures of the world?" And without waiting for a reply, this is so hard because I can't figure out how to make all these words. I'm going to have to figure out a new system for working with Zoom, because all these, there are people in the waiting room. Okay, there. That there'd been nothing even equivalent. Okay, you guys, I know how to read. There's been nothing equal to it since the Parthenon. I'm sorry, this is so embarrassing, but little words keep popping up in front of my screen. But you get the idea. Everybody, Burnham and all of the other architects, they were just gushing over how phenomenal this building was as this exquisite reinterpretation of ancient Greek and Roman architecture, including the lovely caryatids, which you would find at the Parthenon in the Acropolis, or the Erechtheion, to, you know, all the very, very, very sculptural embellishments, the rotunda. And then another thing that's really awesome about it is when they talked about the planning, you know, and talk about symmetry, you know, this cross-axial plan. One of the things that they cleverly did was that in order to get to the French art, you had to walk through the American art. So I thought that was really clever. Before the fair had even closed in October of 1893, it was clear that a lot of the fair planners, Burnham and others, really wanted to keep one building to stay as a kind of permanent reminder of how important the fair had been. And so there was a movement to keep the Fine Arts Palace. It was the obvious choice. Not only did everyone think it was such a terrific building, but also it had that fire vaulted interior. And so Marshall Field offered a huge donation to purchase some of the collections of natural history collections that had been shown at the fair. And this would then become known as the Field Columbian Museum. It opened on June 4th, 1894. And, you know, I doubt you can really read this article, but it is hysterical. 20,000 people thronged the building that first day. And if you read the little sub headline, it says that the crowds were pushing around and people were breaking things and stealing things, including some robbers got some diamonds from a famous jewelry installation of the exhibit from J.V. Barwell and Company. And it said that Marshall Field is well pleased. I think he might have been well pleased that so many people came, but I doubt he was well pleased that everybody was crashing into display cases and stealing things. By this time, by the time that the fair closed, Atwood was still working for Burnham. Burnham's firm was very busy, and so he was working in the office, you know, designing wonderful Chicago commercial buildings for Burnham. But Burnham was having some problems with Atwood. He was very erratic in his behavior, and eventually Burnham just couldn't put up with it anymore. And in 1895, he fired Charles Atwood. A couple weeks later, he mysteriously died. And this article comes out in the Tribune on December 21st, 1895, kind of blaming Burnham for killing off these architects. And it said, like his partner of exposition days, John Root, he, meaning Atwood, died in the harness, and the death of both of Mr. Burnham's partners, the opinion of the physicians and those who knew them well, is to be traced to overwork. So poor Burnham gets blamed for both of these deaths, but it turns out that Atwood was an opium addict. And so his death that's why he was so erratic and didn't show up on time and all of those problems. One other thing that I thought was really interesting from reading the newspapers right after Atwood's death is the Tribune almost immediately suggested saving the Fine Arts Palace, the Field Columbian Museum, as a permanent structure in his honor. It said the Art Gallery of Jackson Park, now the home of the Field Museum, is at best but a temporary structure, though it would be built more securely than other buildings. Time and weather will soon weaken and damage it. It would be a fitting tribute to Mr. Atwood's genius if this temple could be reproduced in permanent shape and stand as a monument to his genius, or whatever it says, because those words are black. So I thought that was really interesting. But for that moment, you know, it was still kind of a temporary exterior and a more permanent kind of interior. Also in 1895, the South Park commissioners began to work to transform the old fairgrounds back into Parkland, and they hired the firm of Olmsted and Elliott to do so. And so this is the 1895 plan for Jackson Park. And this is kind of a synopsis of their vision for the park. And that's all kind of spelled out here. And so basically their main principles were the things that should be highlighted would be the lake with views from Lakeshore Drive, the fields where children could play, lagoons. So it would be kind of going back to this idea, like the original plan of this interconnected system of lagoons, and the Field Columbian Museum, which should remain and, you know, designed upon formal lines for the sake of architectural harmony. So those were the main ideas. And the Tribune published an article with a vision of what it would look like once it's finished. And I just want you to take a note of this part of the rendering. There's this little area right here where you see kind of these little buildings, and this area that is considered the outdoor gymnasium. So at this time, really through that whole period of the fair planning, the superintendent of the South Park Commission was J. Frank Foster. And he was quite a visionary. He was a really good leader, and he had very strong ideas about what parks should be and what they should provide to people. So it was really his influence in developing the Olmsted's plan for redesigning the park that meant that they incorporated this outdoor gymnasium with the little tracks that were meant for running, for jogging, and for bicycles, and then a playground right in here. So that part of the plan was executed. The idea of the building was labeled as a field house, which was really a very, very new idea that there hadn't really been a building type called the field house. And I don't know if at that point he was thinking, they're thinking it's right by the field. There wasn't a lot written about it, and that really wasn't executed. But that was the 1895 plan. But the J. Frank Foster and the park commissioners, they were working on improving Jackson Park and the Midway Plaisance, but that wasn't their only focus. They were really worried about a lot of other neighborhoods within their taxing jurisdiction. By that time, really by 1900, more than 750,000 people lived a mile or further from any park. And the South Park commissioners began doing a survey of the conditions of their neighborhood and realized there were a lot of tenement districts, and that as they kind of studied neighborhoods that they didn't think they were properly serving, they found hordes of dirty and poorly clothed children swarming in the public ways with no green spot nearby to refresh them or their little ones. So I guess that sounds a little weird because I said poorly clothed children, but it actually said mothers and children. I think I just missed a little bit of the quote. The South Park commissioners were very inspired by Jane Addams and what she was doing in Chicago. And of course, Jane Addams had founded the first settlement house in the country, and which of course was on the west side, but they were really helping people within the whole, all of the tenement districts. And so the Hull House realized, the settlement house workers of Hull House realized early on that tenement children really were in dire need of safe, clean, safe places for them to play. And so Hull House opened the first playground in 1893. And so the South Park commissioners decided they wanted to do something with playgrounds, but a lot of the little settlement house playgrounds were nothing more than dirt lots. And so they wanted to do something more. They decided to do an experiment. In 1901, they opened a new park, the first new park that had been created on the South Side since in 30 years, and they named it McKinley Park. President McKinley had just been assassinated, and it included playgrounds, ball fields, and a swimming lake. And just a little changing, little building. They had like little changing booths and lockers. They decided to do this as an experiment, see how well it was received. It was extremely well received. So they got new legislation passed in 1903 so they could build new parks. And they developed a plan for 14 new, what they called small parks. This is a really cool plan that's in the special collections. And it's basically showing their goal was to create a park within walking distance of every home. And so it shows you within like every quarter-mile radius. And I know you can't really see it, but this is showing Davis Square. These are the 14 parks. There's actually a couple down here too, but the system of new parks that they were trying to create. And here's McKinley Park here. This is the stockyards. So it's really cool. But so that was their vision, to try to create 14 new parks. They got legislation, and they hired the Olmsted Brothers and D.H. Burnham and Company to start working on these new parks. J. Frank Foster had a meeting with the Olmsted Brothers in December of 1903 to discuss his vision for these parks. He wanted them to provide open space, recreational, facilities, but they were also going to serve as a vehicle of social reform. And so they kind of worked together, and this plan, which is in the Library of Congress, is on the back of a piece of hotel stationery. So they were having another meeting in a hotel, and so you can just imagine him rattling off what he wanted in these parks, and then fast and furiously trying to figure out how to zone in all of these features. He wanted the new parks to have ball fields, running tracks, sand pits, swimming pools, outdoor swimming pools. That was kind of a big thing. Wading pools, outdoor gymnasia, a playground, landscaped areas with shade trees, and then a new type of building that had never really existed before, the field house, which was a community center that would have a library, lunchroom, auditorium, indoor gymnasiums, and club rooms. And at this point, D.H. Burnham and Company, of course, was in charge of fieldhouse designs, but he was waiting for a new architect to start. He had just hired Edward Bennett, an Englishman who had studied at the École des Beaux Arts and who had helped him with the, they did a design competition for West Point. And so Bennett started in 1904. They were able to complete plans, both the Olmsted Brothers and D.H. Burnham and Company, for the first 10 parks. They opened the first 10 parks by the end of 1905. Each of these parks included a field house. And of course, you know, these buildings had to be built inexpensively, built quickly, and they wanted them to be very classical. And so they used exposed aggregate concrete, and that way, not only could they build, you know, quickly and inexpensively, but they could mold in classical details. And one thing that's really cool when you look at the actual buildings themselves, or if you look at a photo like this, you can kind of see how they put up these, you know, these molds, these forms, and then they would tamp down the concrete, and that's how you get these kind of striations. So, it was just very, very new material to be building in at that time. And again, they were trying to create something that was reminiscent of the Columbian Exposition. So the buildings were designed as architectural complexes around the swimming pools. And again, the outdoor swimming pools was a huge deal. People didn't really have access to running water, and now you could use a shower bath in the swimming pool. And so these architectural complexes, just like the Court of Honor, would be sort of almost forming these courts around the swimming pool. And Henry Foreman, the president of the South Park Commission, really came right out and said that the field houses reflect in miniature the architectural beauty of the World's Fair buildings. There was also, there were other architectural journals and magazines that published. This was a huge deal. And so they very consciously felt that these, you know, really poor immigrant children in these neighborhoods would be uplifted by having the exposure to good architecture. And so this was one architectural journal that said the effect of a good building in which an untrained boy studies or plays cannot fail in the long run to, oh no, I still can't see, something for a higher standard of public and private taste. And so here you can see this was Mark White Square. This one is not, this building is not there anymore, but they never used the exact same architectural plans, but they had the same vocabulary of elements, and you can really get that very strong sense of sort of monumentality and classicism. And of course, all of those features that I rattled off were hugely important to the communities. This was, you know, these were communities that were in dire need of services. And so as I said, the first 10 of these parks had opened by the end of 1905. They did a tremendous job of collecting data. And so here you can see the numbers of uses, how many times these 10 parks, including the field houses, were used over the course of a year, over 5 million times. And because this was such an enormous accomplishment, people, you know, throughout the country knew that this
Julia,
yeah.
I'm just interrupting you to let you know you got 9 more minutes. And if we want to take a question or two.
Okay, that's perfect then. In 1907, there was a decision that we would have a parks conference here in Chicago. And because of the magnitude of this accomplishment, President Teddy Roosevelt issued a national statement stressing that people should send representatives to this meeting in Chicago where they would highlight this magnificent new system of parks, one of the most notable civic achievements in any American city. The idea was also promoted in the Plan of Chicago. There was a whole chapter on the neighborhood parks in this seminal city plan that was published by Burnham and Bennett. And also notice that in this plan, they are also including a vision for a new building for the Field Museum in the middle of Grant Park. That's a whole other chapter of the Plan of Chicago. And of course, Burnham had developed plans for Marshall Field's new building. This is a very long story that we don't have the time to tell you the whole thing, but basically Montgomery Ward, Marshall Field's business rival, knew that there were early restrictions against building in the middle of Grant Park. And so there were various lawsuits for state Supreme Court cases. that prevented the construction of the building in that spot, which would have been really where the Buckingham Fountain is. And so it was finally decided at the end of 1911 that it would be built on new landfill south of Grant Park, and that by doing so, it was going to take a while. And so the building doesn't get built until 1920. By doing so, they are leaving behind the old Field Columbian Museum, old Fine Arts Palace, which now you can see in the 20s is really starting to decay. I even think some frat boys may have climbed up there because it looks like there's some Greek insignia. Maybe someone can blow this up and figure out if that's a particular fraternity or something. But at any rate, now is the question, what are we going to do with the fabulous old building that was left behind when in 1921, the new Field Museum opens up downtown at the end of Grant Park, and we've left behind the old building in Jackson Park. There were groups of architects who wanted to save the building. The AIA came out quite strongly for that, but there were others who argued against it and said this represents a bygone era. And of course, who was one of the most vocal critics saying we should just tear it down? Louis Sullivan. In his autobiography, he said, the damage wrought by the World's Fair will last for half a century from its date, if not longer. It has penetrated deep into the constitution of the American mind, affecting their lesions significant of dementia. Well, luckily, I think, my personal taste, luckily, this movement to save the building really caught on, and it caught the attention of a great Chicago philanthropist, Julius Rosenwald. Julius Rosenwald was the CEO of Sears Roebuck and Company. He lived on the South Side in this house on Ellis, and he was an amazing philanthropist. He gave money to a lot of Chicago institutions and causes, the University of Chicago, a lot of Jewish, important Jewish organizations and causes. He also got to know Booker T. Washington and really wanted to do important things for African Americans. And one of the things that he did was he started a program that of building schools across the rural South. He actually would donate a portion of the money, and the community had to donate a portion, and there was also sweat equity involved. And this would provide, he wanted to make sure that African Americans throughout the country had access to good public education, and more than 5,000 of these Rosenwald schools were built. So he really was a tremendous philanthropist, and I have to throw in a plug that there is a movement afoot to create a national park for Julius Rosenwald that would include a thematic park with some schools, as well as a visitor center in Chicago. But it was Rosenwald himself who came up with the idea of saving the building for use as a science museum. The Commercial Club of Chicago issued a survey asking their members to come up with big ideas, and in 1925, that was Julius Rosenwald's big idea, and he was willing to help pay for it. He came forward and asked the park commissioners if they might be interested if he were willing to help with the fundraising. He even took the Board of Commissioners and their families on a trip to Germany to see the most innovative, cutting-edge science museums that had just recently opened, really in the world. And he talked about how he had taken his children there and that they loved the push-button exhibits where you can actually, learn by doing. And the commissioners thought this was wonderful, and he ended up really creating a whole campaign where others also donated, and he ended up, you can see this in 26, he committed $3 million. It ended up being a lot more than that. He ended up, the South Park commissioners hired Graham Anderson, Probst and White. Ernest Graham had been one of the assistants to Atwood, and reclad the building in limestone so that it would be a permanent building. Alfred Shaw, a beloved, at that point, a very young Chicago architect, was in charge of the project for the firm, and later created his own firm, ended up doing a very, very careful exterior recreation in limestone while they created beautiful Art Deco interior spaces. And that left us with this incredible legacy. And I think the legacy of the Museum of Science and Industry is in part the museum itself, because I love the story about Rosenwald's own children, because I remember my family, and I bet you many of you feel the same way, especially those of us who grew up in Chicago, that coming to the Museum of Science and Industry, my brother always called it the push button museum. So the legacy includes the exhibits, which the coal mine is still there. And then of course the legacy of the field houses. We started out with 10 in Chicago, and we have over 240 in Chicago, and it's spread all over the country. Philadelphia has 125 of them. These buildings are as relevant to date. They are still building them. This is a brand new one that was just designed and built in Ellis Park. And so I think I might have just done it, Hallie, just within the 9 minutes you were going to give me. So hopefully I've left us just a few moments for questions.
Well, we have 2 questions. I'm going to take those 2 questions, and then I think we'll be hitting our mark. I do want to mention my kids, who are in their 20s now, used to call it the Museum of Science and Interesting. Anyway, so here's a question. You mentioned a lot of sleepless nights for Burnham Root and the other architects leading up to the exposition. Can you narrate what a long day or night in their life would have consisted of specifically? Do you have a sense for what they could get done in a single day?
Oh, that is a great question. And I'm sure many of you have read The Devil in the White City. And it's funny because Eric Larson also draws a lot from Donald Miller from The City of the Century. The thing that sticks in my mind was that Burnham had to live there, and that he was living in a shack. So you couldn't take out the time to go back and forth to Evanston every day, which, you know, granted would take longer than Hallie's commute to Evanston. So, and again, I think even the story about Burnham taking the train to Chicago and immediately going to his office. So I would have to guess that these were, you know, 12, 14, 15-hour days. I remember one of those 2 books, there were great stories about the love letters that he wrote to his wife, because he didn't see his wife or his children during that whole entire time. So those kinds of sources for those personal stories are what I have to go to, because you can't get that kind of information from looking at plans and drawings, which are the materials that I always had access to. But I did recently realize that there are certain things that you can just pull up on Google Books, like Harriet Monroe's book about John Root. Of course, he died before they finished the fair, but that was Harriet Monroe's brother-in-law, was John Root. So it's really fun trying to find those sources that get us into that sort of personal stuff.
Okay, so let's see. Someone sent you a question directly, so we'll let you handle that on your own because there was a link. And then the library staff mentions there's a couple of questions that came our way. Do you want to just answer one of them, ask one of them, Joanna, and then we'll wrap things up?
Sure. Do you know if Charles Atwood left a widow or children behind when he died?
Oh, this is the type of thing where you just kick yourself, because I didn't pay as much attention as I should have. But yes, there was some little bit of a scandal. There was some, I think she was an opera singer, and I can't remember why that when he died, that the newspaper articles that I saw had to do with whether or not she could lay claim to his estate. And I don't know if it was because they were split, maybe. I really didn't read them very carefully, but he was married. I don't think they had any children. And again, you know, I love all this personal stuff. And in this case, I think I didn't pay as much attention because I knew that he like scooted on to Chicago without his family. So I didn't pay as much attention, but he was living here. Burnham hired him on the spot during that meeting, and he moved to Chicago. And so he did end up living here for those last few years of his life.
Okay,
you know,
great.
One thing you might want to mention, Joe, is how easy it is to search the Chicago Tribune using the Chicago Public Library website. And so you can tell a lot of my sources come from newspapers, and I I guess I'm telling it for you, Joe. You might want to chime in.
If you have a Chicago Public Library card, you can do it from your home, just through the website. It'll ask you to enter your card number, and you can search away.
And you go to online resources A to Z, and you can go to Chicago Tribune Historical Archive.
And if you have a library card from a nearby library, does it work, or do you have to have a Chicago Public Library card?
To use ours, you would need a Chicago Public Library card. There are ways to get reciprocal cards for suburban libraries. I am not very well versed in it because our materials don't circulate. but
you know what? All the suburban libraries, I think all of them, or certainly most of them, also have access to ProQuest. So you might have to find out how to search on your library, but they do a similar thing, that they do have access to.
Yeah, many libraries in the area probably subscribe to that particular database because it's so relevant.
But you know, I do also just want to kind of leave us with this, with the tip that, you know, especially for all of you CAC docents who do such amazing work. And I wanted to mention, and we're going to send you kind of a follow-up email with a few resources that I'm suggesting. But one of them I included, Maurice Champagne, who's a CAC docent, did a lot of research on the whole issue about the Field Museum moving out of the Field Columbian building, out of the Fine Arts building, and all of the debate about whether or not it would be in the middle of Grant Park, if it would be stay in Jackson Park. It was this very long, drawn out story, and he published a little booklet that you can download on the Kindle. And I meant to mention that when I got to that part of the story, but I will send you those links. And I think it only costs 99 cents. It's well worth the $1 to get that.
Okay, so put a little information about that in the follow-up email. And Julia, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody here. I know this was a very quick, for all of us, it felt like a very quick hour. I hope it felt the same to you. So we always thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And to everyone else, I want to thank you on behalf of the Chicago Public Library and the Chicago Architecture Center for joining us tonight. We actually were almost 200 people, really enjoying a wonderful lecture. And I hope if you have time that you'll go to the library and see the exhibit as well. So again, thank you everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you either at the library or at the Architecture Center, and check out our website at architecture.org for upcoming programs that we do have. So thank you again.